Hello. In this video we're going to look at how to take an input using the JOptionPane showInputDialog method, and then we're going to validate that to make sure that they inputted a valid value. If they don't, we're going to loop around and ask the question again. So I just have an initial setup here. We use the class JOptionPane, we use the method showInputDialog, and then we print out what we want. And at the very end here I use the JOptionPane class. I use the showMessageDialog to print out done. So if I run this right now, it says inputted option, choice 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B, C, D, and it's done. Okay? Now, if we run this and the person puts W, we don't want this to run. So how do we do this? So the first thing we're going to need is we're going to need a string variable to store the value from showInputDialog and then to process it. So if you hover over the method here, you'll see that if we look at the header, we see that it returns a string. This tells me what it spits out when it's done. So when I run this, whatever I type into this box here gets generated as a string and then sent back to be processed. So if I come here and I declare a string called input, and for now we're going to put just anything in it. We'll put an empty string in there, and I go input equals that value. So if I say done, and let's just, so we can demonstrate this, oops, plus input, and I run this, it says input, I put A, done, and we see the person inputted A. So again, this is the method showInputDialog. We can see it returns a string, so I need a string to store that value. So what I want to do is I want to actually give some instructions to the computer to loop and repeat this line if the user doesn't input A, B, C, or D. So from a background perspective here, a theory perspective, we're going to use a loop, and there's a number of different types of loops. But the best loop in this case is what's called a do-while loop. The reason why a do-while loop is ideal here is because a do-while loop always asks or runs the code once. I know I have to ask this question once, so I'm going to use a do-while. And the way we do that is we start by putting the word do, we open a brace, I'm going to tab that in, and then the code that I want to repeat, I'm going to put inside this do-while. Close brace, while, and now I put my condition here. So how do I now inspect this? So there's a number of different ways I can do this. So what I can do here is, I want to loop as long as what? Well, I want to loop as long as input dot equals ignore case. So we're going to use the equals ignore case. We're going to loop as long as it's not an A. That's what that's saying. It says you're going to loop as long as the user does not input an A. So input is a string. Equals ignore case is a string method. I can see that equals ignore case returns a boolean. So the way this method works is it takes whatever the implied object is, which is input, compares it to whatever the parameter is that passed in, and returns true or false. If they're the same, it generates true. If they're different, it generates false. So we want to continue as long as the input is not A. So in other words, if I put W here, W is not equal to A, so false is equivalent to false, and we loop back to the start. So watch how this goes. W, W, T, R. So see, what's happening is every time I put an input in, it's checking, is it not A? And since it's not A, it loops back to the start. If I put an A here, it exits. Now there is a shorter way to write this. We could write this by going not equals. This is a shorthand for checking if this method generates a false, because if it generates a false, it then inverts it to true, and then it loops around. So we're going to say while input is not equal to A. Now we want to continue as long as it's not equal to A, and it's not equal to B, and it's not equal to C, and it's not equal to D. So we're going to say and not input dot equals ignore case B, and not input dot equals ignore case, C, and not input equals ignore case, D. So what I have now here is I'm saying, come down here, enter my do while, prompt the user to take an input, store the value in the value input, and then check. If it's not equal to A, and it's not equal to B, and it's not equal to C, and it's not equal to D, I want you to ask this question again. So if we run this, and I put in R, that's no good, Y, that's no good, but if I put in B, done, your input is B. Now, one last little thing here which might be nice is, we probably want to prompt the user that they've inputted something invalid. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put an if statement inside this do while loop. Now you'll notice that it's tabbed in because it's inside this structure. So if, and in fact I'm going to take this exact same condition here. So I'm going to say, we're going to copy this. So basically I'm saying, if the input is not equal to A, and the input is not equal to B, and the input is not equal to C, and the input is not equal to D, we're going to do JOptionPane dot show message dialog, which pops up a dialog box, null, comma, invalid value, or invalid input. Really doesn't matter. So if I run this now, input option, R, invalid input, then it loops back in. Input option, B, that's valid, good. Now you'll notice that there's an equals and there's an equals ignore case. Equals ignore case doesn't matter if you enter a lowercase or uppercase a. Now before I end this video, I want to show one last thing. I'm just going to pause the video for a second to pull something up. So what I've pulled up for you is the class documentation for the JOptionPane and the string class. So in this little example we were working through here, we use the JOptionPane class. I know it's a class because it's capitalized. And we use the string class. I know it's a class because it's capitalized. All classes are capitalized. So make sure when you make your class, you capitalize it. It won't give you an error if you make this a small s, but it's just good programming etiquette. So when I found this equals ignore case, I can look inside here for all the documentation. In all my other videos, I've kind of said this, and I'm going to repeat this again, is that there are lots of methods. What's really important you do is learn how to go and use the documentation to find what you need. Anyways, I hope that helped.